Hello everyone, and welcome to this webinar on core components in social interventions.
And hi all you 500 that registered to this webinar. We are very lucky to so many to be interested.
This seminar is part of a series that's arranged by Forte in cooperation with the National Board of Health and Welfare and SBU. And together we arrange 4 seminars per year on intervention research in social services and psychiatry. My name is Isabel. I am the program coordinator for the Applied Welfare Research Program at Forte. And this is a 10-year government-funded program that aims to improve the state of knowledge in the social services sector, and this through client and practice-oriented research. And to make this happen, we need more knowledge about the effects of interventions, but also on how to adapt and implement them. And this is what we will learn about and discuss here today. You are welcome to comment or ask questions to our speakers during the seminar. And to do this, you need to follow the seminar on our website, where below the embedded streaming window, you will find the question form. The seminar will be recorded and made available to you on Monday, and you are most welcome to share the recording with your colleagues. And if you want to share your participation here today on social media, you are most welcome to do so. And as Knut said, we have a lot of participants with us today, somewhere around 500, representing a wide range of organizations and perspective, which is of course wonderful. And with that, I will hand the word over to Knut from SBU, who will guide us through this seminar today.
Thank you very much. Since this seminar series started in 2007, the number of intervention research has increased tremendously. Still, most of the interventions in use within social services are not evaluated in such a fashion that you can surely be fairly sure on the effects. Now, if we had knowledge on core components, on the change things, the things that cause change, we could also be more confident in choosing between different interventions, as well as we could also develop better interventions more suited for special population and outcome. So today's seminar with those core components, or as they also called common elements, active ingredients and behavior kernels, will be introduced by our guest Frances Gardner. Frances will talk about 30 minutes, and then we have 3 commentators that will each talk for about 10 minutes, engage Frances in a discussion, and then at the end we have perhaps approximately 15 minutes for general discussion, as well as feeding in the questions from the audience out there. So, Frances Gardner, she's Professor of Child and Family Psychology at Oxford. Her research focuses on the development and testing of parenting interventions for reducing child behavior problems and violence against children. And she's done this research throughout the world in the low, middle and high income countries. And her work has had considerable impact on policy and practice. She advises to government ministries in many countries, as well as to WHO and UNICEF. She's a founder member of WHO's Parenting for Lifelong Health initiative, and she serves on the board of Blueprint for Violence Prevention and on a WHO expert panel on standards of evidence in violence prevention, etc., etc. So, Frances, we are looking very much forward to hear your presentation.
Good afternoon. I'm Frances Gardner from the University of Oxford. I'm going to talk about essential components of social interventions using the example of parenting interventions, but these methods and approaches are applicable to any field and have indeed been done in many kinds of fields. Just a quick thank you to the team, especially to Patty Leishton from the University of Amsterdam, who's really the star of all this work, and particularly thanks to Knut Sundell and the Swedish Board of Health and Welfare for starting off these systematic reviews that we first conducted some 8 or so years ago. and which have been expanded now and now are forming part of a WHO guideline on parenting interventions for preventing maltreatment of children. The aims today, as I said, are to focus on the field of parenting interventions, but this is very much applicable to other social, psychological, and indeed any healthcare interventions. We're going to look at why do we want to study essential components? What are the advantages and limitations of different methods for identifying essential components? And then I'm going to move on to some examples of what we found from our parenting component studies using two methods, meta-regression and factorial experiments. And then I hope we'll have discussion about how useful are these studies and what are the implications for policy and practice. Now, psychosocial interventions can often be seen as being something like drug cocktails. These have many different components, but we're not always sure which ones are working, which ones are not needed, and therefore could be eliminated from the mix. And if we take the example of parenting interventions, which are for reducing harsh and abusive parenting and improving children's behavioral problems, then we might ask, can we identify which components are essential, which are superfluous, and are some components even potentially harmful? And I guess what that means really is, in this context, what this means is, might those components reduce the benefit that's found from other components? So why is it useful to identify essential components? Well, first of all, the scientific value is going to help us to understand the mechanisms that underlie the effects of the intervention. And then secondly, there's many values to actually applications in practice and policy. And I guess that's in many ways what we're all most interested in. So understanding components can help us improve the efficacy of interventions, their efficiency, to improve implementation and scalability. And that, I think, in many ways, that's the kind of $64,000 question about effective evidence-based interventions, is how do we actually get them to scale and sustain them? And also they may help us improve evidence-based tailoring of interventions. Now, the first three of these probably primarily mean, can we slim the interventions down and reduce the cost and the burden and yet still have the same kinds of effects? And for this, we need to know which elements are most important. So what is a component? As is obvious to you, it includes the content of an intervention. So for instance, if we had a school bullying intervention, then it might have components like class debate, class discussion, didactic lessons, elements teaching bystanders how to respond to bullying, counselling for bullies, and so on. And interventions would vary in the content components that they have. But equally important are delivery components. So for instance, when it comes to parenting interventions, they may be delivered to groups or individuals. They may be delivered in different settings, such as in the home or in a healthcare centre. And then finally, we have the facilitator or therapist characteristics. So what profession, what type of training do they have, and so on. Now, if we take just one program, one parenting program, they tend to have many, many components. This is just one by Tom Deschamps, the Everyday Parenting Curriculum. And there are all these components just of these one interventions. So clearly it could be quite a challenge to work out which ones are most effective and useful. So what kind of methods can we use to discern or identify these components? I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the methods and some of their strengths and limitations. If you want more detail on this, then I'd recommend you a paper that's recently come out outlining these different methods and critiquing them, that's listed at the bottom of this slide. I know there's going to be a recording of this, and I'm very happy to share the slides as well, if that will be helpful for people. Essentially, they fall into two camps, correlational methods and causal or experimental ones. Now, you all know, of course, that causation doesn't equal causality. So in the little picture there, we can observe that, excuse me, we might observe in real life that there's a association between people getting sunburn and people eating ice creams. We all, of course, know that eating ice creams doesn't cause sunburn, and we all know that a third factor, in fact, is causing both these things, which is high levels of sunshine. This is pretty obvious to you, I know, but it's really quite easy for people to forget this when they're talking about intervention research, especially when the associations between things seem quite plausible that they might have a causal connection, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they do. So I think we want to bear this in mind whenever we're looking at any kinds of correlational data here. So here's some of the different methods. The top four are descriptive or correlational methods, and the bottom two are experimental ones. They're not the only methods we could use, but I thought I'd put out some of the major ones and not make the slide too busy. For each one, I've tried to give some sense of the pros and cons of the different methods in terms of whether they can test causality, their external validity or generalizability across different kinds of settings and interventions, and their feasibility. Now, you'll see that most of the methods I've judged to have quite high external validity, so they get green pluses. And that's because they all test interventions in real world settings and therefore have something to tell us about those real world settings. With some variation, of course, the more settings that you test at once, then you could say that the greater generalizability you have. And these methods do vary somewhat by how many things you can test at once. In the feasibility column, I've rated most of the descriptive and correlational methods as more feasible than the experimental ones. That's not to say that doing factorial experiments is necessarily difficult or multi-arm trials, but it certainly means that it's not feasible to test as many components all at once as you would in a meta-analysis. And factorial experiments are much more efficient at testing more components at once than multi-arm trials, which is the one that gets the red blob under feasibility. And then finally, last and not least, probably most important, is causal inference. So it's much harder to know what's causing what in a component analysis that isn't experimental. So that's the top four compared to the bottom two. And of course, you know, we don't necessarily, it's pretty important. It's not a mere scientific nicety. If the component that we're trying to test or understand has no causal effect, then we shouldn't be basing policy or practice on the information that we've got from that study. Okay, now I'm going to switch to parenting examples and give a little background on these interventions in order to make sense of the examples for those of you that may not be familiar with parenting interventions. Parenting interventions have been developed for reducing child disruptive behavior, and they do this through improving positive parenting and reducing harsh parenting. And therefore, the same interventions are also applicable for reducing maltreatment and violence against children, and have been used with those populations as well as with kids with behavioral difficulties. And there's a substantial evidence base for these interventions from over 300 randomized trials and many systematic reviews. It seems 14 trials in Europe, and we found the interventions were equally likely to be effective for disadvantaged families or ethnic minority families in Europe, and for any age of child between age 2 and 10. They're equally likely to be effective for those disadvantaged groups compared to more average families. And then importantly, a number of other studies have found this too, is that these interventions appear to be more effective if the parent is more depressed or the child has higher levels of behavioral problems, suggesting that these interventions are particularly effective when they're targeted rather than used programs. They seem to transport quite well across countries. For instance, you've had good outcomes in Sweden for some programs developed in the United States, as well as, I think, poor outcomes for some other programs too. And now this, as a result of all this evidence and all this interest in early interventions for children, early as in, in the first 10 or more years of life, then these, the findings of these trials have been written into policy guidelines globally. But nevertheless, some families don't benefit, the effect sizes could be bigger, the programs are costly, and they're particularly challenging to take to scale, as with all complex interventions. So we still want to know if they could be slimmed down or improved. Just to take you through some of the typical components of parenting interventions, I'll use the example of the Incredible Years program here, but this is typical of many effective evidence-based programs based on social learning theory principles. This one is delivered in a group, has a collaborative leader style. Practicing at home is core to the program. And you'll see some of the elements of the program in this pyramid, starting with joint play, responsive joint play between parent and child, building up positive behaviors with praise and incentives, and then moving upwards, setting clear routines and limits for children, and then much more sparingly techniques to what do we actually do when the child misbehaves, how do we respond to problem behavior in a way that's non-violent to the child. And of course, within each of these layers, there's a number of components within them, within a program that might last for 6 to 15 sessions or so, depending on which version of which program you're looking at. Okay, back to this chart. The methods with the rings, with the red rings around them, are the ones that I'm going to describe some examples of, and that's meta-analysis. So using meta-regression to link the presence of components to program outcomes, and then secondly, factorial experiments. First of all, meta-regression linking components to intervention effect sizes. So this method assesses interventions that do include a given component with interventions that don't include a given component. This method has been used in many, many fields. You can easily, if you want to look up if there are component studies for your the types of interventions you do, then a quick search in Google Scholar will find, if you search something like systematic reviews of components of interventions or naming the intervention, you'll see what there is out there in your field. There's much more likely to be component studies, of course, if there are quite a lot of evaluations of those interventions. If there aren't, then the component studies wouldn't be done in this particular way, most likely. In the parenting field, there's a very highly cited review by Kaminsky in 2008. That's now extremely old, as they did their searches in about 2002. But Patty Leitchton has done a much larger update recently with 154 trials of parenting interventions. And in our recent update for the WHO guideline, we're now on to about 278 trials. So it's a pretty substantial evidence base for these kind of parenting interventions, similar to the one I described for several years. The strengths of this method are the high generalizability, and this is because the analysis is based on hundreds of on dozens or hundreds of studies, the results don't hinge on a single intervention type or context or study, but synthesize data across lots of them, and so it can also include many different types of components in the same analysis. The limitations are the ones I mentioned before, that you can't be sure about the causal relationship between components and outcomes, but also that the results depend, well, related to this, but the results depend on the patterns of combinations of components in particular programs. So this means that, for instance, if Incredible Years has parent-child play in it, and if that component came out as better or worse than the other ones, then the effect of that component could be related to the fact that it's always bundled up with one or two particular programs, and it could be something else about those programs that's driving the differential outcomes that you get in these components analysis. And that's the problem about the sunshine and the ice creams and things, that when it's translated into this context. Okay. So what did we do? We did a big systematic review, as I said, of these parenting interventions with 154 trials of social learning theory parenting interventions between the ages of about 2 to 10. And what we did was to look at the effects of content components, for instance, psychoeducation, praise, rewards, timeout, parent-child play, and so on, and delivery components. So that's group versus individual-based, program length, was the child included in the sessions or just the parents, and so on. And then we also asked, do the essential components vary by level of need of the children? Is it a targeted or a universal intervention? So what did we find? This is based on our meta-regression and some other reviews that we've done, and also looking across the literature a bit more widely. The components associated with better outcomes were primarily the traditional behavioral components that you get in a social learning theory parenting intervention, such as praise and positive reinforcement. Proactive parenting techniques also came out well, positive direct commands, rule setting, monitoring, and so on. And consistent consequences for misbehavior, that was also helpful. Some of the more marginal techniques where the data were less clear if they were associated with, I have to say, not say less clear if they were effective, but less clear if they were associated with good effects, were common discipline techniques such as time out. This seemed to have only a modest relationship with outcome, although it has been stronger in other studies, possibly suggesting that we don't want to necessarily drop this one yet. And then there were components that were not associated with better outcomes. And this one was a bit of a surprise, that the relationship enhancement techniques that everybody loves and thinks are really important, that parent-child play, responsive play, it's often thought that it was essential to build up these positive relationships before you move on to disciplining your child differently. But we didn't find, in the main analysis across all the trials, we didn't find any effect, any additional benefit. I'm using causal words again, any additional association with outcomes for this factor. And then adding more things, extra skills to the parents, which means, adding some quite different kinds of components, such as, for instance, parents working on parent self-control or co-parenting methods and so on. They didn't associate with better outcomes, possibly not because they're not necessarily good things to do, but perhaps they detract from some of the main parenting approaches and perhaps overload the programs. So that's the components. Now moving, I mean, the content components, moving on to delivery. We found that essentially the delivery components didn't make a difference. So they weren't, different delivery components weren't particularly associated with different outcome successes. So whether it was a group versus an individual program, or whether the child was included in the session, didn't seem to make a difference. In many analyses, making the program longer did not make it better. And in some cases, longer programs had smaller effects. And this has been found in some meta-analyses and not others, that they actually were associated with less effects than shorter programs. And obviously that's very counterintuitive, in that most people would feel that getting more of something good was a good thing, but this hasn't been borne out by the literature. And then what about differential effects? Because maybe what's essential isn't the same for everyone. So do components vary by the level of need of the children? Well, these findings were a little bit more complicated, but basically we found that the relationship building via parent-child play was associated with stronger effects in treatment trials, so kids who already got high levels of behavior problems, but weaker effects in prevention trials. So it suggests that this component may not be necessary in prevention programs, but may be helpful for higher need children. Whereas the core kind of behavioral strategies, praise and positive discipline and so on, appeared to be associated with good outcomes across the board in both the prevention and the sort of more high need sorts of families. Now moving on to experimental methods. This is where we can really get at what's influencing what. I'm going to briefly mention multi-arm dismantling trials, partly because the most striking, the most stunning example of one really was done in Sweden, comparing a multi-arm trial, comparing I think 5 different parenting interventions in a sort of head-to-head comparison. And these are quite commonly used methods, and they're great because they can test causality and test the added value of a component. The Swedish trial wasn't actually assessing components, but obviously we could infer something about the effects of different components by testing different programs against each other that have different characteristics. But the limitations of these multi-arm trials are that it's very costly to look at more than a few components or approaches, especially given that parenting interventions have lots and lots of components. So they're not all that practical, but there is quite a lot of data on the effects of things like timeout and stuff from dismantling trials like this that have just compared a program version with timeout in it and a program version without timeout in it, for instance. There's quite a few studies like that in the literature which are quite useful. So I'm going to move on to factorial experiments, which are quite exciting. These have been really inspired and developed for this field, for the field of prevention and social intervention, by Linda Collins at Penn State University, and she devised the MOST framework for optimizing behavioral interventions. It's been used across lots of fields, and factorial experiments are part of that, and they seem to be the most efficient way to test causal effects of multiple components all at once. They do this by having much enhanced power compared to similar size regular multi-arm trials testing the same components, and you can also test interactions between components as well as additive effects. So just a brief example of a factorial experiment that we've just completed as part of an ongoing multi-stage project in 3 middle-income countries in Southeastern Europe. This is the Parenting for Lifelong Health program for children ages 2 to 10. in Moldova, North Macedonia, and Romania. The 3 phases were that we started with a feasibility study and adaptation. We moved on to a factorial experiment, and then based entirely on the results of that factorial experiment, we then tested the optimized version of the program in a randomized trial, and we're just finishing off that part of it now. But what did we do in the factorial experiment? We wanted to test the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of components in multiple combinations, and parents were randomly allocated to all possible combinations of these conditions. And the conditions we were interested in, they're very practical implementation things. We were obviously constrained by, there's no point in testing 2 options of implementation unless both options are kind of realistic and desirable. There'd be no point in testing whether 10 sessions works better than 59 sessions if no one's actually going to do 59 sessions in real life. So it took quite a lot of thought about what were the kind of meaningful things to do. And we were very interested particularly in whether you actually needed a 10-session program or whether you could get similar effects with a 5-session program, and which would then be quite a lot cheaper. We also wanted to test engagement boosters using text messages to remind people about the program. And we thought it wasn't very realistic to just completely to not do any text messaging at all, because that's so simple and cheap. So therefore, what we wanted to test was enhanced information in the text messages versus pretty basic ones. And then we also tested different levels of supervision, regular supervision for 2 hours every couple of weeks versus people just asking for help from supervisors when they wanted. And that was by choice, but also intended to be more occasional. This was the design of the factorial study. On the left, you can see the 3 conditions with 2 levels of each condition. And these were intended to affect implementation factors like parent attendance and engagement, which in turn might affect parenting, which in turn would affect child behavior problems. And then the factorial design itself on the top right, of the 3 components with 2 possible levels, this leads to 8 possible combinations to allocate people to. And you can see that we had about, on the right-hand column, we had about 100 families in each of these conditions. So what did we find? Well, perhaps a little bit reminding me of some of the meta-analytic results, we actually found rather few differences in effectiveness for the different delivery components. And basically this means we would then turn to looking at the cost effectiveness of each option in order to decide what we might want to do next. And of course, we were, in the optimized version in the randomized trial, then we went for testing the kind of the slimmer versions, if you like, since there wasn't a clear evidence that one was more effective than the other. And it was interesting that we found no effect of 10 versus 5 sessions, because we were, it was difficult to turn the program into a 5-session program. It felt quite sort of packed, and different stakeholders, if you like, have very different views about whether longer or shorter is better for a program. It obviously makes sense that shorter is good because it's cheaper and less burdensome for parents as well as for the service delivery. And parents often, when they're asked about what they think about programs before they've done them, they worry that 10 sessions is too much and they won't have time, and that 5 sessions will be better. On the other hand, when you ask parents after they've done a program, many parents say they wish it had gone on longer. So it's not entirely clear what people actually want, although it is pretty clear which is cheaper. And certainly, as experienced clinicians say say to us, these are really difficult things for people to learn. So how can you learn it in 5 sessions, and when it's quite a struggle even in 10? So there are many different views about this. Okay, just moving on to the conclusions now. So we can see, so I'm just going to switch to my own slides. It's quite hard to see the ones that are posted up here. Okay, so just to summarize then, there seems to be value in testing components because most interventions involve many different parts, but we don't know which ones are effective. And if we did know, then we might be able to improve efficiency in dissemination and implementation success, especially at scale. But a really important use of these analyses, as Knut mentioned at the beginning, is to help us in choosing programs. So especially if you're wanting to assess the likely effectiveness of an existing, perhaps homegrown program, but one which doesn't have a formal evidence base, then it's fairly straightforward to test, just to do a simple assessment of that program against a well-tested list of key components, which we really do have, I think, for the parenting field, even though we're not sure which ones could be taken out, and which may well exist in other fields as well. We can see that in the parenting field, there's a range of useful methods with different strengths and weaknesses, which involve both conducting new studies and synthesizing old ones. And in this field, there's a lot of data in relation to people using meta-regression and systematic review, several dismantling trials, but not much use of other methods. And I think there's some reasonable conclusions from these, that the findings don't really pick out particular components that need to go, but rather they suggest that we shouldn't be removing timeout, praise, consequences, proactive parenting, and so on from these interventions. By one or other of the methods, they don't seem to be superfluous. Other components we're less sure about, and I guess we then revert back to another method, which is just listing components. As the components make up effective packages, it's quite likely that many of them are important, which is rather reverting to a less sophisticated way of thinking about it. But I think at the moment we don't have the evidence to really know what to give up. Policy implications. So in the parenting intervention field, there's substantial evidence that these interventions work and that they transport well across countries and across social and ethnic groups. And of course, with such an accumulation of evidence in this field, we had expected our component analysis to perhaps have some more distinctive policy implications for parenting interventions. And as I said before, they do seem to affirm that many components are important and that they can be useful in helping to choose programs that are likely to work where we don't yet have strong direct evidence about them. But I think more work's needed before we can slim down programs in the real world. And then finally, some research implications. Of several methods, some allow for causal inference, and I think we need to probably prioritize these methods. And I think we need to develop better programs of components research across different fields, testing content and delivery, and using these causal designs before we can really recommend more efficient versions. Factorial designs are perhaps the best way forward to do this, but I guess we should use these in combination with lessons from correlational research as they complement each other. And as we saw, they have different strengths and weaknesses from each other, really. And then, of course, we want to continue to look at more nuanced questions about moderators for component effects, for which families and for which problems, about prevention versus treatment settings, but also possibly the possibility of personalization of interventions for individuals and not just for groups. Thank you for listening. If you want to see our publications, you can find them all on Google Scholar, where you'll find that most people's publications in most fields are mostly available for free for you, even if you don't work in a university. So that's really useful. And here's a list of some of our various publications using these different methods for discerning components in the parenting field. Thank you.
Thank you, Frances. Excellent presentation. We will now move on to the first discussant, Jill Fialdini Jenny-Dogan. Jill is a social worker and cognitive behavioral therapist with a long experience of social work with youth and families from a municipality organization perspective. Jill is now working as a manager and team leader for a private social health care company, developing and managing intensive treatment for families in social health care and youth in foster care. Jill, please, let us hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm not muted? Yeah. Hi, everybody, and hi, Dr. Gardner. Thank you. It was very interesting, your presentation, and I read your paper about especially the treatment for children with disruptive child behavior. I'm very interested in that field. That's what I'm working with today, so thank you so much. I really like the discussion of evidence-based tailoring. I'm not sure I really understand the expression, so I'm going to start with asking you to elaborate a little bit on that expression. What do you put in evidence-based tailoring?
Oh, right. Okay. Evidence-based tailoring. I guess when we're working with individual families, we obviously make choices all the time about which interventions or which parts of interventions or what sort of approaches we might do based on our experience and knowledge of that family and their needs and their wishes and so on. So that would, in a sense, that you could say that was we tailor interventions to people and to context all the time. But I guess evidence-based tailoring would be when you've started to gather evidence about which kinds of families or children might benefit most from a particular intervention, and start to use that knowledge about who would benefit and from what components. So you're looking at a combination of, you're looking at differential effects by different kinds of families, but also by different kinds of components as well. And an example of that tailoring and taking into account the components work might be that if you had a child who has quite marked behavior problems and his mother's quite depressed, then based on our meta-analysis, that there was a suggestion that people should be using the programs that teach good behavior management skills, but should also be including the components about relationship building through play. But the importance about the parent depression and the tailoring is that, and it can be quite counterintuitive, because I've heard a lot of people say that that it's not much point in sending a very depressed mother to a parenting program without treating the depression first. People often say that. But this wasn't borne out in our study of 1,500 families in trials across Europe, because there was just a consistently stronger effect on child behavior problems in the parents that were more depressed. And we even tested for a non-linear effect. We wondered if maybe at the very high levels of depression, the parents can't engage at all, and mid-levels they could, and lower levels they could as well. But we couldn't see in the data any effect whereby the most severely depressed mothers were not able to see benefit from the program. There wasn't a drop-off even at the higher levels of depression. So cautiously, because it's only data and it goes against our common sense, then it seems like we have evidence that can help us make those tailoring choices. And one of those, in that example, one of those tailoring choices might be that a depressed mother shouldn't go to a parenting program. In fact, the evidence suggests that's okay, and this is probably what it should include.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think I thought I really understood that. So, and what I put in the evidence-based tailor expression is that in my field, we have to work with families with specific susceptibility all the time. And you were talking about depression can be one, and stress and time, and that they don't have the ability to come to a group session. So thank you for your answer. And I think it's very interesting that treatment can be both evidence-based and tailored at the same time, because what I meet every day in my work practice is that our assignments that we get from the social services, maybe they want us to work with the children's behavior just as one risk factor. And then we have the family and the parents. And so would you say that it's from your studies on key components and core components in this parental program, would you say that it's still good evidence and a good alternative to just focus on the core components in a bigger intervention and just like tailor it together? Would it still be a good evidence-based implementation alternative for me as a leader?
Sorry, you mean if you did use all the core components?
Yes, just
yes.
The core components in this parenting program, but not the whole program. I'm just like taking out the positive reinforcement and the praise in particular and the natural logical consequences, working with the building relationship, and then other interventions in this whole package, but not the whole parenting program.
I think this is, I think if I've understood your question right, can we just do the core ones that came out
Yes.
and not the whole thing?
Yes, that was my question.
I'm not sure I'm quite understood, but they are most of the whole thing. So yes, we probably need to do most of the whole thing, because they are most of the whole thing. I mean, I haven't given a list of all the commonest elements that appear in these effective programs. I haven't given you a list of that, but I think that most of the components that came out in our analyses do make up quite a large part of the program. So yes, you'd still be doing most of the program if that's what I'm not quite sure I've answered the question.
No, yeah, you did, because right. my question was if it was reasonable to assume that there is enough evidence that treatment can still be directed but tailored in this way. But I understand that you say no, still do the whole program. So I'm asking it in an implementation point of view, because a lot of times I have to choose, because it can be really hard for these families. Some treatment obstacles can be that they don't have time and it's too advanced to work with them, and we cannot get them into the offices. You have to do the treatment in their homes.
Yeah.
So if you have to choose,
I think
would it be nice to choose just the core components?
I think because we don't know quite enough yet about which ones could be missed out and which can't, because nothing terribly clear so far has come out of these, and I think it needs more experimental studies. Then one thing I might do, I'm going to slightly switch tack now, is I might go to look at the literature on which of the briefer programs are still pretty effective. And there's a recent systematic review of relatively brief parenting interventions, maybe 6 sessions or less. And I would go to that and look at which ones seem to be effective, for instance, to keep them brief. And I think that's probably, with our current state of knowledge, I think that's probably how I would approach that.
Yeah, because the problem is not always that they're long programs. Those families often want to have a long contact, but they cannot be too advanced. I mean, they have to be like focusing on 3 or 4 goals.
Yeah.
And just focusing. Maybe you do the same lesson 5 times with the parents. So it's not about how many sessions. It's more about what you're doing. Like scale it down.
Yeah. Okay. And I suppose I don't really feel the evidence can tell us which ones of those to pick yet.
Okay.
And I think that, but I mean, you know, as long as they come from an evidence-based program and they make sense to the practitioner and the family to kind of focus in on a few of those, then probably, you know, their gut instinct about which ones to do is probably no worse than what we know from, you know, from the evidence at this point, I think.
And I have another question, because when I was reading your paper, I saw that you have chosen to exclude children in foster care and children with a diagnosis of autism. And can we elaborate a little bit on that choice?
Excluded from the meta-analysis. Yeah, sure. I mean, we just exclude those interventions because in case of autism anyway, the interventions are rather different, and they can be rather different for foster care, even if they include a lot of the same components. So it doesn't really make sense to put them all in the same meta-analysis and draw, you know, either a single conclusion about main effects or to investigate components of interventions where you need some elements of it that are quite different for children with autism, for instance. So it doesn't really make sense to put them all in the same review. But there's as you probably know, there's a huge number of trials of parenting and other interventions with kids with autism and also with children with other developmental disabilities. So there's a lot of evidence to go for it there, and there are some component analyses in that field, in the autism field as well, or certainly in the developmental disabilities field.
So your findings are not applicable for children in foster care. That's what I hear you say.
The components findings, no.
No.
I mean, as you probably know, the evidence is a bit mixed on the effectiveness of these kinds of parenting interventions in foster care. And there have been some studies that don't find any effects of these interventions with these kids. And this is always a complete puzzle to me, because I think, you know, you've got some kids that, you know, are badly in need of kind of consistent caring, parenting and clear rules and routines and things. And you've got very motivated, often very skilled parents, foster parents wanting to do these interventions. And it's quite a mystery to me why they wouldn't be more resoundingly effective as they haven't always been in some of the trials.
Yeah. So is there need for more and different research on these children? Because in my field, we work with these families in foster care, and these children, they have this disruptive child behavior, and so they have the same needs. So my question was, do we need more research or different research, and how can we be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, there have been some studies from London, from Stephen Scott, trying to look at sort of using combination of attachment and behavioural interventions to try and help foster kids. So it'd be possible to go and look up what they've found with those. But I mean, I would find it very hard to believe that these good parenting principles wouldn't be useful for foster parents. But you know, as I say, the evidence doesn't always support that. Doesn't always support that view.
So it's more about that we don't have the evidence.
Yeah, and there's quite a small number of trials compared to with non-foster families.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you for very relevant questions. You will have more chance to discuss further on. But we move on to the next discussant, Victor Caldo. He's a clinical psychologist, professor in clinical psychology at Linnaeus University, and is also a research group leader at Karolinska Institutet. Victor, please.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Frances, for a really interesting talk. I think this area is interesting in both aspects, both the parenting part and the methods part. And I'm not a really expert on parenting at all. We're doing a little research on a good behavior game in schools, kind of similar. but I'm more going to focus on the methods. But I've been doing research on psychological treatments, and I just have to comment on one thing, on the part where you should, with depressed mothers, maybe treat depression first. I would say that is not at all obvious from theory. If you, for example, look at how you treat depressed patients, behavioral activation is a very good thing to do. And trying to do something meaningful is a very good behavioral activation, besides from just getting out of your house and so on. So I think there's a lot of ideas about depression, but if you look at what's efficient for depression, it's kind of like, well, if you do anything with depression, that's better than nothing. So just a brief comment on that. But then I would like to think about the terms that you use. I cannot compare them to the psychotherapy process research and so on, because you call it essential core components. And in psychotherapy, psychological treatment, we talk a lot about specific components. And we compare those to common factors or non-specific effects. Like, for example, as a therapist, you're supposed to be empathic, and you should have the same goals as the patient, and you should have a good working relationship. You should be nice in general, of course. And those are like common factors, and it has been shown that quite much of the effect from psychological treatment comes from these common factors. And would you say, is there an equivalent term in your area, or is it too different from psychological treatment to talk about some kind of factors that just should be there, always included? Because if you don't have them, that will kind of spoil things. But it might not be that they are giving the greatest effect or the specific effects.
Yeah, that's a good question. And of course, I mean, in many ways that that the field hasn't pursued that question to the in the way that you describe in the psychotherapy field. I'm not quite sure why. I mean, when people first started doing behavioral parenting interventions, they did run trials where they had non-specific control groups where people like just discussed parenting or something, and maybe had a warm group leader, but didn't learn any very particular techniques. And generally, the people doing those trials concluded that those ones didn't work. And I think we kind of moved away from that question. But I mean, the question doesn't go away just because somebody did 2 trials that showed that the non-specific factors probably weren't important. So probably we should be. I mean, possibly we should be pursuing that. I'm not quite sure. I mean, I suppose if I was being very skeptical of the power of specific components rather than general ones, then I might say, well, maybe the reason why we're not finding particular components are particularly important could be because there's a lot of general stuff going on about allowing people not just the warmth and chance to discuss parenting that you get from a group, but maybe the chance to reflect in a more specific way about your parenting, but not necessarily any particular techniques. I don't know whether we would call that a specific or a general factor. I'm not sure, somewhere in between perhaps. But I think, there haven't been enough studies to establish whether
and I think you also have
specifics are really important or not.
Yeah, I think you also have a bit more complicated way in what you do, because we treat the individual patient directly. We teach the parent, and the parent do most of the work. Yeah. So it's I mean, when we talk about common factors, yes, you should be nice and pedagogical to parents when you teach them, of course. So it's difficult to sort it out, I think, because you have 2 levels.
Yeah, I agree. It is a bit different. It's less plausible that just someone being nice to the parent would then let them go home and improve their parenting skills in the same way, where that could potentially perhaps affect someone's depression.
Yeah. Then I have a pure methodological question. I've been involved, I've not been doing it myself, but in some large meta-analysis with my studies included. And one of them were meta-network analysis, a patient-level meta-network analysis. And it's quite similar to the meta-regression you showed, but I get the impression that it's kind of more complicated and more evolved, and possibly also a bit closer to causality. I don't know if you're into this area, or if you have looked at network.
Yeah, but did you say individual patient data
Yes.
network meta-analysis?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, there's some of those in depression in depression treatments, aren't there?
Yeah, and we did one on internet treatment for depression.
Yes, right. Yeah, I've seen that one. Yes, I haven't completely got my head around what is a individual participant data network meta-analysis, because we've done individual participant data meta-analysis and we've done network meta-analysis, but we haven't yet brought the two together. But I mean, obviously, the possibilities for being able to look at moderators of outcome and components all in the same analysis, especially if you've got enough individual variation. I don't know, within the online interventions that you studied in that review, there was enough variation between individuals in the components they got.
Yes,
as well as in their outcomes.
It was like in a program, you have like these 10 components or 5 components, and you also added like wait lists or non-specific treatments like placebos and so on. So these were included as.
I mean, that would be amazing if you could then begin to sort out which people benefited from which components. That would be fantastic, and that would be the ultimate in this evidence-based tailoring that we were talking about. And I guess I hadn't thought about, I mean, we've got some big individual participant data sets, and Patty's making some bigger ones. So we've got the data, but but in our field, there's not enough variation between individuals in the components they receive, because they're group-based interventions. And they, everyone in the group, but also everyone doing that intervention gets the same stuff. So, I haven't thought how that would work at individual level, because in our regular meta-analyses, which obviously only work at trial level, the interventions don't. Anyway, the components don't vary within trials, so it wouldn't be so good in this field. But it sounds amazing where you've got lots of individuals getting different things to work out.
Yeah, and actually they built a kind of predictor where you could add patients' base, sociodemographic backgrounds and clinical factors and so on, and you kind of got a prediction on what would be good for this patient. But that is not enough to rely on. But it was fun to see that could be made from that.
That sounds amazing.
I'm really interested also in factorial designs. And I'm a bit curious, when you did this large trial, was it difficult to get all these, service providers out there doing the regular, not treatment, but care? And was it difficult to get them on board with your trial? Because I think this is highly interesting in what you could possibly do if you get regular service providers doing this more. Then we could have a lot of data. And doing it in a more structured way.
I haven't seen all the data on how correctly they were implemented yet. I mean, we've only just got these results. I haven't seen the data on how correctly they were implemented, because you might expect that if people weren't on board, or it was actually very impractical for them to do all these different things, then you might expect poor fidelity to what they were supposed to be doing. So that will be an interesting metric. I mean, I'm not there on the ground in the 3 countries to see what people think about it. But it did seem to be possible. Obviously, we worried about just that before. It did seem to be possible. But also we've got, you've at least got the efficiency that each person is running a group that either has 5 people in or 10 people at once. They haven't got to keep remembering to switch the things they're doing all the time, because they're running a whole group with this with this, or a different group which doesn't have the text messages or something. And they're not responsible for most of those things. Like they don't necessarily have to manage all the text messages themselves. What was the other one? The level of supervision. Again, that's just what's available. But I think in this case, the particular delivery components we assessed weren't particularly burdensome for the. No. I don't mean there's no burden, but weren't as burdensome as if they had to keep choosing different things and different elements for different people, and refraining from doing things they would have liked to do because the protocol has said don't do that with this person. It wouldn't necessarily be as bad as it might sound.
No, but did they then they did accept the idea of doing different things? Because I think it's interesting, in many cases services actually have no idea on what to do, but they still just think and then choose something. And you could, I think, just say to them, well, why don't you do a randomized trial within your service? You might not even need researchers if you just use a method. That's what Facebook do when they test different advertisements on us. They have A/B designs all the times. And I think it's a really interesting thing to think about. Why don't the society use this more?
And it's so easy. Now we're doing more online interventions.
Yes.
Because, particularly because of COVID, and also, trying to go to scale in low middle income countries, then it's really nice to do those A/B designs and things without having to burden people with any of the details. People just,
and data collection
with consent, just receive different messages or different arrangements in their devices and so on, which is great. But as for people getting the idea, I mean, we were running this as a research study in the southeastern European countries. So the people, the investigators of the trials and the factorial design were also running and, either employing or having quite a lot of oversight of the people running the interventions, even though they were in real world services in two of the sites anyway. So there wasn't such a problem about the mismatch between what a researcher might want to do and what the service providers might want to do. But I agree, if you were doing it in the real world, then that might seem might be an obstacle.
Thank you, Victor. It's time to move to the third discussant, John Cubley. He's head of a research group for prevention and treatment at the Regional Center for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, and is also a professor at the Department of Education, University of Oslo. Please.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Frances, for your great presentation. It's always such a pleasure to listen to you, and I think your work is helping us move the field forward in a great way. So thank you again. So I'm wondering, Frances, one of the things you talked about briefly is our focus on programs rather than components. Do you think this is something that has hindered us in developing more effective interventions?
What, the focus on programs?
Yeah, rather than components.
It's just that if you have a set of effective components and you deliver them to people, in a sense, you're putting the package back together. And so is there really such a difference between those two things? Because you still have to in some way, in some sense, you have to have a package for people.
Yeah.
You have to know what you're going to do this week and next week and so on, especially in a group-based intervention. And you have to give it a name, and you have to tell them, you have to see if people are going to come 5 times or 10 times or what. There has to be some planning, especially in a group-based intervention. So is it so different to have a set of effective components versus a package? I'm not even quite sure if there's such a difference.
No, I agree with you. What I'm wondering about is more the use of RCTs. The classic RCT, has this maybe hindered us in developing more effective interventions? as you suggest, maybe the factorial trials or other types of designs are better at helping us develop more or bigger effect sizes.
Yeah, I guess that would, more of those would help, but it's not that RCTs have hindered what we do, because after all, within this optimization model, after you've tested all the different components to see which is best, you're still supposed to test the whole thing again, a package, but a new package.
Yeah.
You're still supposed to test the whole thing in a randomized trial. So
yeah.
It doesn't dampen my enthusiasm for randomized trials.
Me neither. So we need more types of research, and we still need the RCT. Is that right?
Yeah. And I mean, if there's a problem with packages, maybe the commercialization of packages maybe is a problem. Commercialization is good because it can get things out there to the public, and the market forces can sometimes do that very efficiently. But on the other hand, when you have program developers of commercial programs also involved in many of the trials of those interventions, and the materials being proprietary and not that easy to disseminate or to sort of shift around a little bit, or to tailor, then maybe that's a hindrance. But that's not a problem with RCTs. That's a problem with how we fund and deal with intellectual property and all sorts of things like that. It's a problem of lots of things and have people's conflicts of interest and so on. But so it's a problem with packages, but not with RCTs.
Good point. I have a related question. Do you think we should change our research agenda now that we have like Linda Collins' framework, we have the IDEs framework developed at Harvard? None of them are against RCT. They just say that we need also other types of research or trials. Do you think now that, are we at the stage now that we should change the standards of evidence?
I mean, I don't know if it's back to packages versus components, but as long as you have packages, you still need to know if they work. And that's still the most, probably the most sensible way to do that is through randomized trials. Am I just being unimaginative and not seeing quite what you mean? I mean, if we then want to slim them down, we need factorial studies.
Yeah, for sure. And what I'm maybe suggesting is that before we go to the RCT, like I've done all my life, I've only done RCT, so I'm guilty here. But so I'm thinking that maybe before we go to the RCT, maybe we should do like factorial trials, maybe n equals 1 studies, more single trials. So we have different options before we go to the RCT, I mean.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes we just need different practices. All the data need to be more transparent and open because there may be biases and conflicts of interest involved. That's one thing. But also, if we really want to understand tailoring and what works for whom, then we need all that individual data to be pooled. Rather than needing new trials, you want the quite hard work of pooling the data across trials to really understand about tailoring to different kinds of families and different kinds of children. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and that's not different from an RCT model, but it's saying let's make better use of what we've already got. So that would be important.
Yeah.
And obviously, if we want to understand how people react to programs, the practicalities of delivery, the barriers and things like that, for that we need qualitative studies and other kinds of information. So obviously it depends what the question is that we're asking. whether it's the right model. But if you just want to know whether something works, then I kind of agree with your combination of factorial studies and regular randomized trials.
Yeah. So one thing you have talked about is the connection between systematic reviews, which is correlational, and experimental studies, right? So one of the things I've been struggling with is, okay, so let's say we have like 40 components that we're interested in. That will also take a lot of time and resources to test, even though factorial trials are more resource friendly than the RCT. So in order to save time and money, could we test clusters of components that we are pretty sure work together? Could that also be something that we could do in the factorial trials, you think?
Yeah, I guess so. We could cluster them together. It doesn't completely answer whether we didn't need all the parts of the cluster. You know, if we're really serious about slimming things down, it doesn't completely answer if we need all the parts of the cluster. I guess there's a lot of questions also about whether the different combinations of components might actually be quite context dependent, context specific, in which case, so are the component combinations generalizable, the particular patterns that we might find in one study versus another? I mean, we know that the overall results transfer. So I think that's quite a tricky one. I guess I don't have any really good answers to that. I think in our Romanian, Moldovan, Macedonian study, we were keen to just prioritize the things that we could answer that were going to be relatively simple to implement and definitely seemed important to implementation at scale. So it's just prioritizing what your need is or what you think might be most likely to give you a useful result. But I think, yeah, I don't have an easy answer to how we deal with the 40, with the 40 different components. But obviously, we do end up grouping them. You're right, into major areas or the areas that maybe make up a natural unit, like the session of a parenting program. That could be your component because that's already in chunks, and you're saying, do we need this chunk versus that one?
Yeah, you win something by doing it, but you lose something as well, right? So yeah, I was thinking, you talk about the fact that we will wind up with maybe new packages, more refined, more effective packages by this approach. But is it necessarily this case that we will wind up with so structured packages that we have today? Could it be that we wind up with more like a toolbox of effective components that can be used more freely by practitioners?
I'm just wondering about what would be the grounds for choosing them from the toolbox which could be incredibly useful based on individual needs. And a sort of common sense idea of how a particular need relates to a particular component, or based on experience and common sense. I'm just wondering how we use that in parenting interventions, which are largely group-based. That's all. How you use the toolbox to suit the needs when you've got 10 parents in front of you. That's all.
Yeah.
And again, maybe I'm just not being very imaginative.
No, that's a good point. It's hard to do that in group therapy, of course. But I was thinking about more individualized.
Then that could be really good, because you could have components based on the problems that they bring, or based on the kind of approaches that the clinician feels that the person needs to deal with the problem in front of them. Yeah. And presumably, in effect, that's what a lot of people, that's what many people do with individual-based programs anyway.
That's true. That's true.
Thank you, Jon, and thank you, Frances. We have some questions from the audience which I would like to share with you, and anyone could answer them. It doesn't have to be Frances, that is.
Right, good.
So I would say, I read them directly and you can choose which one that you jump on. The first one is about the Swedish national trial that was 7-8 years ago with Håkan Stattin as the primary investigator, and that found that a booklet describing parenting practices produced quite large effects, not as large as the programs in themselves. What impact would that result have? That's the first question. The second is, with better knowledge of core components, we can develop local programs that are better suited for a Scandinavian context and perhaps cheaper to use than American programs. Is that a way forward? And the third question is more a methodological question, that is, deals with the problems of recruiting people to RCTs, generally a bit hard. So how can we handle that problem? You're free to answer anyone.
Shall I do the booklets?
Yeah, please.
No, I think this is really important. Now, there have been some trials of booklets showing some effects of some pretty simple interventions like that. And obviously now we have sort of digital versions of booklets and digital ones that are more interactive. And there haven't been that many, haven't been so many head-to-head trials between different programs versus booklets as was included in this big Swedish multi-arm trial. So I suppose I'd want to say more trials, and I'm really looking forward to getting results from our own studies around the world, which I'm kind of loosely involved in, not as much as this stuff, the face-to-face stuff. But we're going to be testing all sorts of different levels of simple information that would be much cheaper, just as a booklet is, to deliver. And so they're digital ones based on text messages, based on interactive kind of chatbots, but also ones based on people having group discussions online on WhatsApp and things like that. So on various levels which have different levels of cost and simplicity to deliver. We're going to be eventually in the next year or so finding out whether any of these simple ways work and what different variants of them make a difference, or whether you need more complex ones. And I think that, it's the right time now to do more research into whether very simple things, whether they be booklets or digital ones, can really make a difference. And I also want to really know whether the interventions work using slightly more objective measures. And one of the reasons we have confidence in the findings of parenting interventions is that we have observational measures of parent-child interaction in some of the trials, and they get quite similar results. But otherwise, we're basing all this evidence on the reports of parents who've been part of the interventions. And I think we need to test that for the simple booklet or digital interventions as well, which is the kind of quite a daunting task with the digital ones, but we want to try and do that.
Okay. Jon, you raised your finger.
Yes, I was, maybe Victor, you were before me?
Please start.
Oh, thank you so much. Swedes are always very gentle and polite. So I was thinking about the second question here. And I think the question was, could we develop more tailored interventions? And the answer, I think, is yes. We can develop more tailored intervention in Scandinavia by doing this. Actually, we're doing that right now. We are very much inspired by Frances' approach, and we are looking at potential elements that are effective, and we want to test them before we go to the factorial trial. We want to use user-centered design in order to make them more adapted to Norwegian context. And we think that's a way to go before we go to the large-scale factorial trial. We want to really tailor it and listen to the users of the interventions before we go large-scale. So I think yes.
Okay, Victor.
Yes, I've been very into something that I call adaptive treatment strategies within psychological treatment, and that is kind of adapting treatment to patients, but waiting for a while in treatment. So let's have a few weeks, see how it works out. And what we do is mostly, since we have self-help treatment that is supported by therapists, we mostly kind of regulate the amount of therapist support they get, and also the how much you can kind of make a specific tailored treatment for this patient, maybe change a few modules or rearrange it or change the time or something like that. But that is kind of based on monitoring outcome all the time, and other factors too, adherence and much more. And then if you get a red signal saying this patient, it might not work out so well, then you act on that. So that might be another kind of strategy where you start with something more basic, not so much support, maybe a lot of booklets. I've been doing kind of booklets for 20 years, but with supports more or less, and with quite long content. But it's an interesting strategy to kind of help out on where to put a lot of effort and where to leave those that can manage more or less on themselves.
Okay, thank you. Jill, you raised your finger as well. Can't hear you.
Am I muted now? No, you hear me now?
Okay, now.
Yes, I was thinking about the second question too, and my answer is yes too, like you, John. But I want to put something else into it. I think it's really important, if we're going to start tailoring those programs, that we in the practitioners will be more into the systematic follow-ups on individual basis on effects, because there are a lot of programs, but I think the systematic follow-ups during the program, there are not so many. And I think that's very important if you start tailoring and putting in elements and taking out elements. I mean, you can be very experimental there. You can have like a baseline design with like A, and then you put B, and then you put C. And that would be an interesting way of working with your toolbox, I think, John, that you have those tools, and then you can measure and have different measure designs in the systematic follow-up. So that would be really interesting. I would like to do that.
Thank you. I will direct the last question to Frances. If you had 20 seconds to talk to Swedish policymakers, what would you say to convince them?
Can I plan this ahead? No. I don't know. Use evidence-based programs, find ways to get them embedded into systems so they sustain. Maybe develop really effective programs that reduce your reliance on commercial imported ones, because we know that they all have the same kind of common elements to them. Yeah. And provided they really do have those and have evidence behind them, then we shouldn't need to have highly imported commercial programs.
Thank you. I will use the last 20 seconds to give some information. First of all, thank you, Frances. Thank you, John. Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Victor. Fabulous presentations, discussion. So on Monday, you will be able to see the video from the seminar on Forte's homepage. The next seminar will probably be in December and will deal with transportability, that is, överförbarhet. Is it possible to bring interventions from the United States to Sweden with fine effects still? I think we passed the time for our presentation today. Thank you once again, everyone, for a fantastic seminar. I hope we see each other again within 1.5 months or something like that. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.